So what I'm going to do is to bring us to BC and some of the background to curriculum change within the province that we've already touched on a bit, but just to give some of the context. Then I'm going to focus on some of the teacher perspectives from the process. I'm really kind of looking at this narrative of the OECD agenda and what we're hearing with Education 2030, and what are some of the potential tensions with what teachers are saying on how it has worked within the province. And then some thoughts around what are some questions we could ask. So if I start out with the transformation, I'll just give some very brief background. As Glenn mentioned at the very beginning, this has been a long process. In 2010, the Ministry of Education began a process to transform education in BC. But what we've also seen from case studies that were produced around this time, so the Global Leaders Education Partnership had produced a case study that said that in 2009, Rod Allen and some other ministry folk were attending a conference, and one of the speakers was from the Innovation Unit in the UK. And they were very struck by the ideas that were shared there around 21st century learning, around the competencies. And it's really where a lot of you see these connections of the global ideas and the minds coming together to shape what this looks like. In terms of the ministry timeline, from 2011 to 2012, they had the initial development work. Something that's significant here is that initially, the BCTF did not participate. Teachers were in job action. So when the ministry is talking, for example, that teachers have been instrumental in developing the framework, teachers within the union were not involved at this stage. It was convened education leaders, academics, pick teachers from different parts of the province, but not from the union. And those were those initial teams of educators providing advice on the proposed structure and the key subject areas. So just pointing to kind of what Julia said earlier, one thing that we continually heard, and I'll go through, is teachers saying, well, where did this come from? And it never being clear. But I think a lot of those beginnings were already in play at this point. So what happened in terms of the time frame then is in 2013, teams of teachers from the union were appointed to the teams. And it's the first time in the province that it's been all grades and all subject levels at the same time. So that's what has made it a very large and different process within the province. In 2016, grades K to 9 were implemented. This past year was grade 10. And as Glenn mentioned, 11 and 12 is not until this coming September is when it's going to be first implemented. So it has been a process, and it's been for the past 10 to 11 years. So, which brings us to tomorrow, and where the conversations have come, that we're going to be showcasing British Columbia's education system in partnership with Education 2030. And so the question as we heard this was, what does that mean? What's being showcased? And what are the experiences of teachers, and how do they speak or not speak to that? And in terms of what we've seen, they're going to be highlighting the approach and the outcomes, the new curriculum, and Indigenous learning. So what I'm going to do is to walk into a little bit of the teacher experiences that can help us understand some of these claims and some of the questions that we could potentially be asking. So, as Anne mentioned, within the research department, we've been doing a 5-year project on curriculum change. And it really came from a place that amid all of these changes, amid the teachers working on the curriculum, a lot of the research that comes out of it within any curriculum change process often focuses on what teachers should do and the success measures of outcomes, but not on what teachers think about the process, not of what their experiences have been, and not on their perspectives. So we were saying, okay, as we're going through this curriculum change process, how can we center the perspective of teachers and understand it from their perspective? So we have wanted to deepen the understanding of the state of curriculum change across the province, position it within the broader historical and political context, such as Education 2030, engage members in a conversation about curriculum change as an ongoing process. So not just the implementation, but the philosophy of it, the approach of it. What does it mean to be having this conversation? And to build our understanding of key elements of what it means to have a flexible, adapted, and fully resourced implementation process. So just an example of some of the activities that we've been working on. We had a survey in 2017, and we're actually currently doing another survey right now. Perspectives of teachers, not just on how implementation is going, but on the philosophy of the curriculum, on the approach, on the working conditions around it, to try to broaden that conversation that curriculum change is a process. Also within the team, Larry's been working on digital reporting tools and what that means in terms of assessment, and has done work on a full-day kindergarten survey and a lot of interesting perspectives from teachers there. I did interviews with members of the curriculum team to try to understand those experiences. And then we've also been doing historical and policy analysis, such as technologies, global discourses around 21st century learning, and how much, and I think JC mentioned this, how much is really new and how much is kind of a recycling of some of these discourses as well. So what I'm going to do is touch on 4 points. And the first, if you think of in terms of the claim of highlighting BC's process and the outcomes, and you think of the process that I talked about at the beginning, yes, teachers working on the teams, it came across again and again, they were told they could start from nothing. They were told they had a clean slate, that they could do what they wanted. And then as the process went on, it was, you can do what you wanted, but it needs to fit this framework. But it has to be in this way. And like Julia said, it was never explained where this way came from. It just kind of landed on every team's desk. And I see other heads nodding of people who are involved in this. And so it was already predetermined, and it happened before the teachers became involved. It also, what is interesting is a lot of people who I talked to couldn't say where it came from. One did tag it directly to the work of Lynn Erickson, who's a US-based academic, and concept-based curriculum is the frame that she uses. And when you go into her work, what becomes incredibly clear is that this curricular model is not just about curriculum, it's about pedagogy. In order to be able to do the curricular model, you have to take up a particular pedagogical approach, which is incredibly problematic on many levels. It'll be interesting to talk to everyone around that. But it also is a way of getting around the idea that the ministry mandates curriculum, and we recognize the ministry mandates curriculum, but teachers are supposed to have autonomy over their pedagogy. And so what has this opened, and what does it potentially shut down in terms of what teachers can do in the professionalism of the profession? And that's something I was thinking earlier when Martin was talking, because he said that teacher agency is highlighted within the learning framework. And that's something when I look at this that becomes incredibly problematic to me, because we can talk about agency, but when the framework has already determined the right way to have that agency, in order to have the right outcomes and be measured on those outcomes, is it really agency? So that's a question that I'll put back forward from there. And I think it's also another part of the danger that this language of agency gets taken up in a way that we can't argue with it. It sounds terrific, but it is being eroded little by little through the way that it's being promoted and framed. So a second area, and again, we've talked, several people have already started to touch on this a bit, is engaging with Indigenous knowledges. So this is an area that the BCTF has been incredibly supportive of and really believes in as part of the TRC, that this needs to be happening across our educational systems and structures. But I think that's part of the key part. It has to be across the whole structure. So what I really heard as I talked to members of the team is that the work was incredibly uneven. And all of them said that it was incredibly important. But some of them had the time and the space and other people to engage with it. They actually said it was the best professional development they've ever done in their lives, because they had that space to think, okay, I am a white settler, how do I engage with this? So it wasn't just about putting in the curriculum, it was their own knowledges. Other people just said, yeah, it was tokenistic. We were never given any time or space to do it, and we had to do it though, so we just put something in. And one of the claims, and I'll say it at the end as well, is that what's now being promoted is that BC has done this in the curriculum, and it's check, it's a done process. But what is being promised to teachers? What is not being included when the whole process itself is already incredibly contested and full of tension to start with? I think also, I mean, a lot of this talks with what, I believe it was towards the end of Sam's talk where we were talking about what was neutral and what's not neutral and how does that get taken up. So as these statements have gone and put into the curriculum, if time and space is not then provided to localize them, to engage, to have the conversations that can bring it together, it does become potentially another form of appropriation. And in my mind, even more dangerous sometimes, because you have checked the box that it's no longer colonial, but it's putting forward that knowledge as part of the system now rather than challenging it. So the third area to highlight is around the core competencies. So the core competencies is what in BC we're calling the social and emotional learning or the psychosocial skills side that we've been talking about throughout the day. In BC, it's around thinking, communication, and social and personal skills. And interesting, again, with one of the tensions that came up this morning, one of the key things for teachers has been, okay, what does this mean in terms of assessment? Because it's now an official part of the curriculum. Students are supposed to self-assess, which has been very problematic for a lot of teachers. There's been no support for them for how do you self-assess this? What does it mean? How do we do this meaningfully? And again, does it become a checkbox? There is also the concern that, you know, it's incredibly important, but how do you fit this into a structure that hasn't changed more broadly? So how do you fit it into not only elementary, but also secondary school? So how do you self-assess critical thinking across multiple timetable schedules, across multiple areas? What does this mean for the teachers and for the students? There's also, it has been critiqued in terms of being individualistic and not necessarily engaging with the broader social political context. And one of the things that's continually come up as teachers have talked to us about this is that most teachers are already doing quite a bit of this in the context of how they're teaching anyway. But when it becomes something to teach, that's when the instrumentalization comes in. It's not that that doesn't happen or it's not important in and of itself. And again, just linked to the previous point, I think one of the other concerns with that is again around those neutral competencies or neutral skills. What does it mean when there are particular now understandings of who children should be and who they are, and whose version of children are we promoting through these discourses? And then the final kind of key point has been around curriculum implementation. So despite the celebration of the curricular process, there has been almost a complete lack of resources for implementation. So teachers that we've talked to through the surveys, they're spending their own money. They've had to redo tons of materials. Things have changed completely for them. They also have not had professional development or the time. And I think that's one of the key challenges in a model like this, because the curricular model is a framework. And what's supposed to happen within that model is it goes to a local level, and then teachers would have the time and space to develop into something teachable, something that they can work with in their context. And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, I'm looking to people who I know are on the teams, that was kind of the idea that was given, that teachers could take this and run with it. But they've been told to take it and run with it without being any time or space to be able to do that. As you have, one of the concerns is you have this very high level curriculum, but there's nothing to hold on to, and people aren't being given the time or space to be able to create the hooks and the ways that they want to work with it. Additionally, assessment and reporting systems are not aligned with curriculum. It was interesting, I was just looking at a press release about tomorrow's event, and it was celebrating the complete redoing of curriculum and assessment. And the K-9 reporting order is still in pilot, and it's going to be in pilot for the next year. And 10, I don't think they're planning on doing until 2021. So I'm just a little bit confused on how that's being celebrated as an assessment change, but I think, and that's been one of our key concerns coming from teachers, that they say, yes, we can try to change what we do with the curriculum, but if you haven't aligned the assessment and reporting structures, it just can't move and it can't change and we can't work with it. We also, through the work, have been trying to look at the broader educational systems and structures to try to say that curriculum is just one part of that process. And if it is one part of the process, how do we think about it as an entire system, an entire structure? So if I take the BC example and try to think of it in terms of the broader conversations we had this morning as well, these were some of the concerns that come up. So again, you know, the idea of 21st century competencies, how much of it is being rationalized by global knowledge economies, and how does that play out within the different contexts that we've talked about today? To what extent might talking about agency herald the deprofessionalization of the teaching profession and not actually a resurgence of teacher agency? To what extent might local knowledges and the celebration of Indigenous knowledge actually be masking the cultural assumptions and expectations and hiding them as they get then rolled out in new forms? And how might it be deployed as a governance tool for educational policy and practice across multiple settings? So one of the things that we wanted to do as we move into tomorrow is to also try to think, everything that we've heard today, it can sometimes feel incredibly overwhelming as well, and kind of what do you do, how do you engage with it, how do you try to think about it? So some of the things that we've been talking about is how do you start to disrupt the narrative? How do you hear about experiences in Mexico, for example, and use that as a way to think differently about some of the assumptions and promises? Or the example from Alberta, how do we think about that? How do we challenge the assumptions? And I think one of the most interesting conversations I find is often, I was just at an educational research conference, and they were talking about the OECD and Education 2030 and PISA, and it needs to be culturally relevant, it needs to be, and they're in-depth conversations. But nobody asked, should it be? It's always how, not should we be doing it in the first place? And what does that open it up, and what does it change in terms of the conversation? How do we mobilize and support local knowledges and processes rather than appropriating them into global processes? And how do we build solidarity? How do we think about experiences with colleagues in Mexico and think about new ways of building a shared voice around some of these issues? How do we think across Canada? And how do we, because often you hear, oh yes, that's going there, but how do we start thinking across all of those different areas? And I'm gonna end it there. So thank you.